Man once held his hand over an open flame until the smell of his own burning skin filled the room, and did not move. Not because he felt nothing. Because he had decided, long before that moment, that pain would never again be the thing that decided what he did next. That decision is the entire subject of what we're about to walk through. Not motivation. Not discipline as a slogan on a poster. The real thing, the brutal, unglamorous, often invisible work of controlling yourself when every instinct in your body is screaming for you to do otherwise. Most men think self-control means resisting a donut or skipping a few drinks. That is the beginner's version, the version sold to you in a 30-second ad. The real version is what Gaius Mucius Scaevola did in that room with the flame, what Cato did facing his own death, what a Stoic emperor did every single morning of a brutal military campaign he never wanted to be fighting. Real self-control is what remains in a man when every excuse for losing it has been handed to him on a plate, and he simply declines to take it. Epictetus put it plainly. No man is free who is not master of himself. Not free from circumstance. Almost no one ever is. Free from the tyranny of his own impulses, which is a far harder and far rarer freedom to win. This is inner steel. And today we are going through 7 brutal disciplines of self-control, each one carried by a man or woman who paid an extraordinary price to demonstrate it, so that you don't have to learn these lessons the same way they did. If you want to actually build this in yourself rather than just admire it in others, subscribe to Inner Steel now, because every story ahead is here to be used, not just watched. Let's begin. Point 1. Self-control means your body does not get a vote. In 508 BC, a young Roman named Gaius Mucius Scaevola walked alone into the camp of an enemy king, Lars Porsena, who was laying siege to Rome. His plan was simple and suicidal: assassinate the king and end the siege in a single act. He made his way close enough to strike, and killed the wrong man, mistaking a royal secretary dressed similarly to the king for his actual target. He was seized immediately and dragged before Porsena himself, surrounded by guards, with no possible path to escape and certain death waiting the moment the king grew tired of questioning him. Porsena, furious and almost certainly intending to have him tortured for information about the plot and his co-conspirators, demanded to know who had sent him and how many more assassins were waiting in Rome. Mucius's response was not a word. There was a brazier burning nearby, prepared for a religious sacrifice. Mucius walked to it, extended his right hand into the flame, and held it there without flinching, without a sound, while the room watched his skin burn, to demonstrate, not tell, demonstrate, exactly how little Porsena's threats and exactly how little pain itself meant to a man who had already decided his life was forfeit for Rome's sake. Porsena, reportedly more shaken by what he had just witnessed than by any army he had faced, ordered Mucius released on the spot, and according to the historical accounts that followed, sued for peace with Rome shortly after, not because Rome had defeated him on a battlefield, but because he had just watched a single unarmed man demonstrate a level of self-mastery that made him question whether a city that could produce such men could ever truly be conquered. Mucius earned the name Scaevola, left-handed. For the rest of his life, a permanent reminder burned into Roman memory of what a man's will can override when he has decided, completely, that his body does not get a vote in the matter. This is the foundation beneath every other form of self-control, the recognition that your body, its pain, its appetite, its fear, its discomfort, is not the same thing as you. It is a vehicle you operate, not a master you obey. Most men spend their entire lives confusing the two, believing that hunger means they must eat now, that anger means they must speak now, that fear means they must retreat now. Mucius proved, with his own hand in actual fire, that this is simply not true. The body screams. The will decides. And when the will has been trained, the screaming changes nothing. Point 2. Self-control is a muscle built in private, not performed in public. Cato the Younger trained himself, deliberately and consistently, in conditions most senators of his wealth and standing would never have voluntarily endured. He walked barefoot and bareheaded through Roman summers and winters alike, not because he couldn't afford shoes or a cloak, but precisely because he could, and chose to forego the comfort anyway. He ate plain food when extravagant feasts were available to him constantly through his political position. He drank in moderation in a culture where excess at banquets was practically an expected display of status. None of this was for an audience, at least not initially. Cato did not parade his austerity through the forum demanding recognition for it. It was private training, repeated daily, for decades, building a tolerance for discomfort that would later prove essential when actual hardship arrived and gave him no choice in the matter. That hardship came in full during the civil war against Julius Caesar, when Cato joined the resistance forces in North Africa. Accounts from that campaign describe forced marches through brutal desert terrain that broke far younger and more physically prepared soldiers, and Cato, already in his late 40s by then, reportedly refused special treatment of any kind, walking rather than riding, sharing the same rationed water as his men, sleeping in the same exposed conditions, because the discomfort he had trained into himself for decades in peacetime had become simply normal to him by the time war demanded it. When the cause was finally and irreversibly lost, with Caesar's victory complete, and no path forward except surrender or death, Cato spent his final night reportedly reading Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue specifically about the soul's relationship to death, twice through, calmly, before ending his own life rather than accept a pardon from the man who had destroyed the republic he'd spent his entire life defending. Even in his final act, accounts describe a composure that seems almost impossible for the circumstance. A man who had so thoroughly trained his response to discomfort and fear that even his own death became simply one more thing to execute with discipline rather than dread. The lesson here cuts against how most men approach self-control today, which is to attempt it loudly, publicly, announce to everyone watching, a New Year's resolution declared online, a diet announced to friends for accountability. Cato's self-control was built entirely in private, in unglamorous, repeated, unwitnessed daily choices that nobody applauded and nobody saw, which is exactly why it held when the moment finally came that actually mattered. A muscle trained only when people are watching will fail you the one time you're alone, and it counts the most. If you're building this kind of discipline in private right now, with no one applauding you for it, that's exactly the work Inner Steel exists to support. Subscribe if that's the path you're on, because we're only 2 points in. Point 3. Self-control means not reacting to what you cannot change. Socrates stood trial in 399 BC before an Athenian jury on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety toward the city's gods, charges that, by most modern historical assessment, were substantially political in nature, driven by years of resentment from powerful men he had publicly embarrassed through relentless questioning in the streets and marketplaces of Athens. Throughout the trial, as recorded in Plato's account, Socrates had every opportunity to grovel, to plead, to perform the kind of desperate emotional appeal that might have swayed a jury toward leniency, a strategy that was, in fact, common and expected in Athenian trials of the period. He refused entirely. He responded to accusations with the same calm, methodical questioning he had used his entire life, even as it became increasingly clear that this approach was alienating rather than persuading the very jury that held his life in their hands. When the jury voted to convict him, and then convened again to decide his sentence, Socrates was given the customary opportunity to propose an alternative punishment to death, exile being the obvious and expected choice, one that virtually any other condemned man would have seized immediately. Socrates instead proposed, with apparent sincerity, that the city should simply continue to support him as it might support a beneficial gadfly, since his questioning had only ever been intended to improve Athens. The jury, unsurprisingly, was not moved by this, and sentenced him to death by poison. In the time between his sentencing and his execution, accounts suggest as long as a month, while Athens waited for a religious ceremony to conclude before allowing executions, Socrates remained, according to multiple students present including Plato, entirely composed. He discussed philosophy with visitors. He refused an opportunity to escape that his friend Crito arranged and pleaded with him to take. On the final day, surrounded by grieving students, he drank the hemlock himself, calmly, and continued discussing the immortality of the soul as the poison took effect, correcting his friend's emotional outbursts rather than indulging his own. What Socrates demonstrated, across an entire trial and the weeks following it, was a refusal to spend a single ounce of energy fighting a verdict he could not change. He could not control the jury's resentment, the political motivations behind his accusers, or the ultimate sentence handed down. He could control, completely, until his last breath, how he responded to all of it. He chose composure over panic, principle over a far easier compromise, and conversation over despair, in circumstances that would have broken almost any other man's self-command entirely. Point 4. Self-control means delaying what you want now for what you want most. Florence Nightingale, born into a wealthy and socially prominent English family in 1820, was expected by every convention of her time and class to marry well, manage a household, and quietly disappear into the comfortable domestic life her parents had spent her entire childhood preparing her for. She received at least one serious marriage proposal from a man she reportedly cared for, by the name of Richard Monckton Milnes, and after years of consideration, she turned it down, not because she didn't feel anything for him, but because she had already decided, with total clarity, that marriage as her society defined it would consume the years and the freedom she needed for the work she felt called toward. That work was nursing, a profession that, in the England of her time, carried almost no social respectability whatsoever, associated more with poverty and disreputable conditions than with the genteel life she was giving it up for. Her family fought her on this for years. Her mother in particular reportedly found the prospect of her daughter doing such work genuinely humiliating. Nightingale persisted anyway, training in nursing wherever she could find institutions willing to teach her, delaying every comfort and every approval her family and her class were prepared to offer her in exchange for compliance. That patience and refusal to take the easier, immediately available path positioned her, by her early 30s, to be asked to lead a contingent of nurses into the Crimean War, where she arrived at military hospitals in conditions of such severe unsanitary neglect that soldiers were dying of disease and infection in numbers that dwarfed combat casualties. She implemented hygiene standards, organized supply chains, and worked hours that reportedly left her physically collapsed at points, and the mortality rate in the hospitals under her management fell dramatically within months. She returned to England as a national figure, and used that platform for decades afterward to reform nursing standards and hospital sanitation practices across the British military and civilian systems, founding a nursing school that still influences the profession today. None of it would have been possible if she had taken the immediate, comfortable, socially rewarded option in her 20s. Self-control, in her case, was not about resisting some small daily temptation. It was about resisting an entire life that was being offered to her on a silver platter, because she had already decided what she wanted most was worth more than what was easiest right now. Point 5. Self-control means governing your tongue even when provoked. Marcus Aurelius spent the bulk of his reign as emperor not in the comfort of Rome, but on military campaigns along the Danube frontier, fighting Germanic tribes in conditions he himself, by his own private writings, found exhausting and at times almost unbearable. He was, by most historical accounts, a man who would have far preferred a quiet life of philosophy and study to the relentless demands of command, and yet he held the responsibility regardless, surrounded constantly by generals, advisors, and political rivals who tested his patience in ways his private journal makes clear bothered him considerably. What survives of his innermost thoughts, collected after his death into what we now call the Meditations, never intended for any audience but himself, reveals a man constantly coaching himself through exactly this discipline, governing his tongue against provocations he very clearly felt but refused to act on. He wrote reminders to himself before facing difficult men each morning. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. He prepared himself deliberately, in writing, for the provocation before it arrived, so that when it did arrive, his reaction had already been decided in calm rather than improvised in anger. There is no surviving record of Marcus Aurelius losing his composure publicly in a way that damaged his rule or his relationships, despite presiding over a reign that included plague, war, betrayal from a trusted general, and the daily friction of governing an empire of competing interests and difficult men. This was not because nothing provoked him. his own writings prove the provocation was real and frequent. It was because he had built, through that same constant private rehearsal, a gap between what he felt and what he said that almost nothing could close by force. This is the discipline most men never build, separating the feeling from the utterance. You will feel anger. You will feel the urge to say the cutting thing, to win the argument, to put the other man in his place with a single well-aimed sentence. Marcus Aurelius felt all of that too, by his own admission, every single day of a difficult reign. The difference between him and most men is simply that he had trained, deliberately and in writing, the gap between the feeling and the spoken word, and that gap is where self-control actually lives. If governing your own tongue under provocation is something you're working on right now, that's the exact discipline this channel is built around. Subscribe to Inner Steel if you want more of this. Point 6. Self-control means resisting the crowd when the crowd is wrong. In 1955, before Rosa Parks became known to history, a community of black residents in Montgomery, Alabama had already endured decades of daily, grinding humiliation on the city's segregated buses, required to give up seats, board through back doors, and tolerate treatment that violated basic dignity as a routine condition of simply getting to work. The pressure to simply comply, to keep your head down, to avoid the very real danger of arrest, violence, or economic retaliation for resistance, was constant and came from every direction, including sometimes from within the black community itself, where many understandably feared the cost of confrontation more than they resented the daily indignity. When Parks refused to give up her seat and was arrested, the boycott that followed required an extraordinary, sustained act of collective self-control from tens of thousands of ordinary people for 381 consecutive days. Domestic workers, factory laborers, and clerks who depended on the bus system to reach jobs they could not afford to lose walked miles each way, organized elaborate carpool systems, and endured arrests, intimidation, and in some documented cases actual violence, bombings targeted at boycott leaders' homes among them. Without abandoning the discipline of nonviolent resistance that organizers like Martin Luther King Jr., then a young pastor newly arrived in the city, insisted upon as the only acceptable response regardless of provocation. This was self-control of a kind rarely discussed, not restraint of one's own private appetite or temper, but the collective restraint of an entire community's justified rage, sustained daily, for over a year, against people who were actively trying to provoke a violent reaction that could be used to discredit the entire movement in the press and the courts. Every act of discipline, walking instead of rioting, organizing instead of retaliating, enduring arrest calmly instead of resisting, was a deliberate choice made under extraordinary pressure to abandon it, made not once but thousands of times by thousands of separate individuals who could have, at almost any point, given the crowd exactly the chaos it wanted from them. The boycott succeeded. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled Montgomery's bus segregation unconstitutional, and the discipline maintained throughout that year became a model for the nonviolent strategy that would carry the broader civil rights movement forward for the following decade. None of it would have held if even a fraction of the participants had surrendered to the immediate, understandable urge to react with the anger the situation absolutely justified. Point 7. Self-control means choosing death on your own terms over life on someone else's. Seneca, in his final hours, faced a situation almost no man could prepare for in the abstract, and almost no man could face with composure and practice. The Emperor Nero, his former pupil, had come to view him as a threat, implicated, likely falsely, in a conspiracy against the throne, and sent soldiers to inform Seneca that his death had been ordered. By the account left by the historian Tacitus, Seneca received the news with almost no visible disturbance. He reportedly asked only that he be permitted to revise his will, a request the officer in charge refused, and Seneca turned calmly to the friends gathered around him and observed that since he could not leave them the gift he wished, he would leave them instead the example of his life, and, in this final moment, the example of how he intended to leave it. He opened his veins, as was the Roman custom for a dignified suicide, and continued speaking with the friends and secretaries present, dictating final thoughts even as the process proved slower and more difficult than expected due to his age and the condition of his body. According to Tacitus's account, He eventually requested poison as well to hasten the process, and when even that proved insufficient, was finally moved to a warm bath, where the warmth was thought to ease the bleeding, and there he died, composed, by every surviving account, until the final moment, having spent his life writing about exactly this kind of discipline and choosing, in the end, to demonstrate it rather than merely describe it one last time. Whatever one makes of the manner of his death, what Seneca refused, completely, was panic. He refused to beg. He refused to let Nero's soldiers witness anything except the sane composed philosopher who had spent decades writing to friends about exactly how a man ought to meet his end, proving, in the last hour available to him, that the writing had not been performance. It had been training, and the training held. This is the final and most extreme form of self-control, the recognition that even when almost everything has been taken from you, your freedom, your safety, eventually your life itself, the manner in which you meet that loss remains entirely, completely yours to decide, and no one, not even an emperor with absolute power over your body, can take that particular decision away from you unless you hand it over yourself. Closing. 7 men and women. 7 different forms of the same brutal discipline. Mucius showed us the body does not get a vote once the will has decided. Cato showed us that self-control built loudly in public fails the moment it's truly tested alone. Socrates showed us what it costs nothing and gains everything to stop fighting what you cannot change. Nightingale showed us that delaying the comfortable choice now is sometimes the only way to reach the life you actually want most. Marcus Aurelius showed us the gap between feeling and speaking is built in private, one written reminder at a time. The Montgomery boycotters showed us self-control can be collective, sustained by thousands of ordinary people refusing, together, to give their opponents the reaction they wanted. And Seneca showed us that even death itself can be met with the same discipline a man trains into every smaller moment that came before it. None of these were easy demonstrations. Every single one of them was paid for, with burned skin, with exile from comfort, with a cup of poison, with a proposal turned down, with a year of walking instead of riding, with veins opened calmly while soldiers waited. Self-control at this level was never free, for any of them, and it will not be free for you either. But it is available to you the same way it was available to every person in this script before they became the kind of person worth telling stories about, through the same daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed choices to let the body, the impulse, the crowd, or the fear lose the vote, every single time it tries to cast one. If this gave you something to carry into today, subscribe to Inner Steel. This channel exists to build exactly this kind of discipline in you, story by story, principle by principle, and there's more of this waiting for you. Brutal self-control is not a personality you're born with. It is a decision, repeated daily, until it becomes who you are.